So I mainly am going to, there's a paper, and the paper's been circulated, and I'm mainly not going to talk about the paper, because I figure all of you read much faster than I talk. So if you just wanted to read the paper, you'd read the paper. So mostly what I'm going to do is set the context of the paper. Why am I worried about the particular set of issues that would lead me to talk about this, and why am I talking about this and not other things? And then embed what's in the paper in that context. So I will get to some discussion of what's in the paper, but I think it's much more important that we sort of start from the general sets of issues that lead to the paper. So the first thing is that what I'm really concerned about is the ability or the capability of organizations to implement effective policy. Now, policy is a mapping from states of the world to actions by agents. So, policy is one of these words that we use like hundreds and hundreds of times without really defining very well. But kind of what a policy means is we take a domain of contingent facts about the world, and a policy formula stipulates what the actions of the public authorized agent should be with respect to states of the world. So a tax policy is, if your sales are this, and the sales tax formula is 3% of sales, the tax I should collect is 3% of what your firm's sales were, right? Now, the problem, the difficulty in the world is there's two sets of questions. Do we have the right sets of policy formula such that if it were the case that the publicly authorized agents actually took the policy formula prescribed action with respect to the states of the world, it would lead to desirable outcomes? So is the policy formula right? The second question is the policy formula being followed? Is your organization actually doing what the policy formula stipulates? Because if your organization isn't doing that, it's not at all clear that improving the policy has any traction on what happens in the world. So let me just start from and my argument is that the problem often, not always, and nothing's always true, isn't either the policy or necessarily the individual capacity to implement policy, it's actually the organization. So let me just give one example. So let me just start with like a simple example of what we might mean. And this is a paper by Alberto Chung and others, including Andre Schleifer, that just came out in August. And basically they just said, what's a governmental function that there's no controversy about? Meaning everybody agrees government should do it, everybody kind of agrees what it is, delivering the mail. It's the most boring conceivable governmental function of all. Everybody agrees government should do it, everybody kind of knows what it means. So they mailed 10 misaddressed letters to countries around the world and said, the International Postal Convention, to which all 157 countries are signatories, says if we get a piece of misaddressed international mail, we return it to the sending countries within 30 days. That's the policy. And the policy formula is the same for every country, because they're all signatories of this convention. So this is a really simple example where we know exactly what the policy formula is. Return the misaddressed letter within the 30 days. And there's not like hugely political controversy about it. So they just mailed letters and said how many came back. So of 157 countries, the lowest countries, 0% of the letters ever came back. So it was as if there was no post office in this country. It just disappears off the face of the earth. And you think, well, yeah, I mean, I'm not an idiot. If I mail a letter to Somalia, I should expect pirates in return, not like, oh, misaddressed, return to sender, right? Because Somalia has zero capability. But this was true of Ghana and Nigeria and Egypt and Russia, Cambodia, kind of countries that we otherwise think of as countries that are countries, right? But zero measured capability of their post office. So it doesn't matter what the formula for the post office was, it just isn't delivering in a very literal sense. The lowest half of the countries kind of classified by years of education, only 21% of the mail came back. The lowest quartile countries, only 9%. Only 1 out of 10 letters came back. So this is just low capability of the organization to carry out even the simplest possible governmental functions and policy formula. And you know, this wasn't like super hard. Meaning, you know, if I showed you that this was, you know, 100% in Denmark, you'd go, wow, that's Denmark, right? But Colombia, Uruguay, countries that are middle-income countries of moderate capability, you know, 90% of the letters come back. It's not like a super complicated thing to like just return your letters to the sending country. So the first thing is this is the capability of the organization of the state to implement is a huge problem. In that 50 years into the process of development, meaning let's take the developmental era to be roughly since countries were politically sovereign independence, all of these countries have been supposedly pursuing the objective of having a post office that delivers the mail. Some countries have succeeded, but many, many countries have had almost zero progress in 50 years in creating a post office that delivers the mail. Second, you know, the second thing is that the extent to which the mapping from states of the world to actions by the agent of the state depends on individual capacity. You know, because we could say, well, the problem is that people don't know what to do. It's complex to be a teacher. It's complex to be a policeman. I don't know what the right mapping is, right? But in some simple things, it's like you know what the state of the world is, and you just don't do it. So Banerjee and others have a paper where they look at the attendance of the auxiliary nurse midwives at the sub-level clinics in India, and they do an experiment in which they try and raise attendance, right? And the experiment involved, you know, lots of things like incentive pay. But there are two interesting things about it. First, you know, the baseline control the baseline experimental group attendance was 45%. Right? So 45% of nurses were present at the clinic on the days they were supposed to be present at the clinic. So what's the state of the world that the policy was mapping from? It was, is it Tuesday at 10 o'clock? Right? It wasn't like, what condition does this patient have? It wasn't like, what should I do in order to induce mothers to have better antenatal care? It was like, is it Tuesday? And if it's Tuesday, I should go to work. Even that, the organization didn't have the capability to make the agents even do that. And the second thing is, when you actually did an experiment to try and increase their attendance, what happened was absence of the control, this is the experimental group, and the absence of nurses actually went down when you did an experiment to try and raise their attendance. But presence went down too. So the number of nurses that were actually in the clinic fell from 45% to 30%. So 10 percentage points less nurses were physically present in the clinics after the implementation of the experiment. And what went up was the number of nurses that were exempted from being present at the clinic. Now, the reason I stress that is that essentially what you did is you replaced a factual problem with a fiction. So now the administrative records of the Indian government show that the absence problem has been solved. Because if you ask what is absence, absence is now less than 10%. But they solved the absence problem without solving the physical presence problem. In fact, making the physical presence problem worse. So if you really cared whether nurses were there, that problem is worse. And what you did is you displaced fact for fiction. So let me just give, these are motivating examples, right? Now let's go to a complex task where organizational capability actually requires agents to respond to very specific states of the world. And the classic sort of response to the state of the world is whether or not is ambulatory curative care. You pitch up to a doctor in a clinic, he's got to respond to what is happening to you right then. The right response to you is you. I mean, like, if you say my back hurts, that's kind of this important diagnostic thing. So Jishnu Das at the bank did a follow-up study of another study he'd done in which fake patients presented with conditions to doctors, and they saw what doctors did in response to a patient who was presenting with conditions to see how they worked through the diagnostic, to see if they came up with the right action with respect to the state of the world. So this now compares what happened in public clinics compared to what happened in private clinics. So for instance, the visit length if you went to a public clinic was only 38% as long as the visit if you went to a private clinic. So basically public doctors churned you through very fast, and the average visit only lasted 2.4 minutes. That's the amount of time you got. Only 12% of the public sector visits did they even check your pulse. And these are patients presenting with the symptoms of asthma. And only 0.6% of the public sector interactions resulted in the doctor coming to the right diagnosis. Again, for a pretty easy, pretty widespread condition. So if we ask ourselves what's the capability of the public sector clinics to deliver health services in rural Madhya Pradesh, the public sector capability is completely independent of the capacity of the doctors in the public sector. So all of these doctors, in fact, knew what to do much more than they did in practice. And the finding out of this study is that the worst medical care available in rural Madhya Pradesh is public sector doctors in public sector practices. They do worse than completely untrained quacks. They do worse than everybody. The best medical care in rural Madhya Pradesh is those exact same doctors in their private sector practices. So if you go to these exact same individuals who have the same capacity as individuals, you will get the best medical care available in rural Madhya Pradesh. If you see these same individuals embedded in the organizational context of the public sector, you get the worst medical care in Bangladesh. So it's not a capacity problem. It's not a policy problem. It's an organizational capability problem. Embedding the individuals in the organization lowers their productivity. It doesn't raise their productivity. Whereas the whole point of organizations is we participate in organizations because it raises our individual productivity over what the individual would be not embedded in an organization. Okay. So the final sort of take on this is, so we see that kind of generic measures of government capability are low. We can't entirely attribute that low governmental capability to the wrong policies, because many times we have perfectly generic policies and they just don't get implemented. Nor can we necessarily attribute it to lack of capacity of the individuals to do what they're slated to do, because oftentimes they're not doing things like, if it's Tuesday, I should go to work. That isn't a lack of ability to recognize it's Tuesday. And as even we move to sophisticated things, what we find is that people are doing much less than they are capable of doing when embedded in the public sector organizational context. And much less than they do the exact same individuals in an alternative organizational context. And then the final thing is that this just kind of isn't getting any better. So if we think about the generic capability of the state, our police forces and teachers and regulators and central banks and the apparatus of the state is a collection of organizations. And if we think about generic indicators of the capability of the state, and I take a generic indicator which is from the quality of government's rankings, which just ranks rule of law, corruptibility, and bureaucratic quality across countries, and gives a score which I normalize to 0 to 10. And then I just ask two questions. First of all, how high is that score today? Because how high it is today gives you some indication of how fast it's growing. And again, you might think you can't infer growth rates from levels, but if you walk into a forest and plants are at very different heights, if you know the age of the plants and the height of the plant now, you know the average growth rate of the plant exactly. Because if you know how old it is and it started at 0, then where it is relative to 0 is how fast it's been growing. So if we still have countries very near zero capability, then we know that their capability is not growing in the long run very fast. So we have the level, which is this is high capability, medium capability, low capability. And then we have the observed growth rate over the last 10 years, 1998 to 2008. The data is a little old. And I also do this with the KK, is it called KKM now or KKZ? KKM? KKM data. I call it the K, as long as there's a K in the middle, right? Anyway, with arts data, I do the same thing and get roughly the same results. But if you look at our countries increasing this measure of capability reasonably fast, stagnating, or in fact have falling levels, what you see is, first of all, many more countries are in this super low capability situation than have actually graduated to high levels of state capability and levels. And second, in terms of changes, many more countries are stagnating or falling than are observed to be rising at any moderate pace. And I choose this pace of 0.05 since it's on a scale of 0 to 10. If you were progressing at 0.05 points a year, it would take you 200 years to get from Somalia to Singapore. So that's kind of, that's what I call fast pace, is if you're doing it faster than 200 years. So these guys are doing it slower than 200 years. These guys, Daddy, how long till we get there? Well, we're driving in reverse still. So the answer is infinity until we get there, because we're driving backwards. Okay. So low levels of state capability, by which I mean the capability of organizations to implement effective policy. This is not necessarily or can't be easily attributed to either kind of lack of individual capacity or the failure to have the right policies. And generically, we're not, as a kind of globally, going in the right direction on this. The average pace of improvement in corruption around the world is measured consistently to be negative. The average pace of improvement in kind of rule of law and bureaucratic quality is, on average, very near zero. So the best we can measure. You know, there are two common folk wisdoms. One folk wisdom is, if at first you don't succeed, try again. Right? The other is, doing the same thing and expecting a different result is the definition of crazy. So when we say try again, we don't mean try the same damn thing. Right? We mean try something different. And the fact that we are now 50 or 60 years into politically sovereign countries attempting to develop capability of the state, or at least claiming to develop capability of the state, not to mention organizations attempting to help countries build capability of the state, and we're still at the levels we are at, suggests that we have a really bad theory of how to do this. If we're generically not succeeding, then it is likely that our generic theory on which our attempts to succeed is based is fundamentally wrong. Because, again, we're not like 10 years into this and, oh, we're about to get it. Right? We're 50 years into this and countries are going backwards. So, what were our theories on which we would build state capability? What was the theory? Well, one which the best description was Justin's from the other day. One theory of, if you ask in 1962, how is it going to be that Kenya will have a well-functioning post office later? That would be your theory of change. What was our theory of, right? And one theory was time passes. So one theory was, you know, my theory of getting from tadpoles to frogs is time passes. It's the natural state of affairs that tadpoles become frogs. So with no particular intervention other than there being the right conditions for survival, a tadpole becomes a frog. So I think, by and large, our major theory of the development of state capability was time passes. We just kind of thought this was something that would be easy. So if you look at the number of papers that have been devoted to the question of how to promote economic growth, compared to the number of papers that have been devoted to the question of how do I get an effective post office, it's kind of, well, the post office was going to be the easy part. and the economic growth was going to be the hard part, right? So now we didn't just settle with time passes, or that it was a, basically you had a theory of, take a theory of the creation of any effective organization, whether it's police or water utility. Basically, the notion was going to transplant the forms of those functional organizations from their existing functional places where there is an effective police force. We're going to transfer the organizational charts and the hierarchical ranks and the human resource procedures and the operational manuals and the uniforms, and then we just kind of wait. And Kenya's police force becomes, the UK's police force. That's just what happens, that we just wait. This theory must be wrong. Deeply wrong, badly wrong. Not always wrong, so some countries it might work, but in the countries in which it hasn't worked, it's hard to argue that just enough time hasn't passed. Particularly because they're moving backwards. Right? So the other theory is that, and this is the one that's far and away the most wildly popular approach to building state capability, is that you build capacity. Right? And so you're going to build individual capacity to get organizational capability. And, there's a phrase in development, you give a man a fish, you feed him for one day. You teach a man to fish, and you feed him for a lifetime. And the real corollary of this is design a project to teach men to fish, so you can give your brother-in-law the contract for technical assistance. So capacity building is a hugely popular developmental activity because we spend a lot of money on it. It's really fun. Everybody likes it because we're not very pressured about results, and we waste tremendous amounts of money on the premise that we need a better post office, and what could be more essential for a better post office than better trained postal workers? What could be more essential to a quality education system than having trained teachers? This theory also, in some sense, is deeply, deeply flawed. And it must be, because again, we've been at it for a long time. There's no question that too little time, attention, and effort has been devoted to building individual capacity in the public sector. Now, the kind of more popular thing now is like, well, the real problem with capability for effective implementation is that we didn't have enough evidence of the right type to be persuasive, convincing, and right about what the right policies to implement were. Now, this kind of assumed that, and therefore, if we created more and better evidence about policy, that would create more effective policy. Now, that's conceivably right, but it kind of assumes that you can separate policy from policy implementation, and that the constraint on organizational's capability to implement effective policy is their knowledge about what effective policy would be. Whereas in many instances we've already seen, organizations aren't doing things which everybody knows are essential to being effective, like showing up for work. So it can hardly be that if your nurses aren't showing up, the nurses doing this versus doing that when they do show up is the key crux of organizational capability. And Justin's paper shows that the what works cannot be separated from the capability of the organization implementing it. So when you took like a contract teacher experiment from the field setting implemented by researchers in an NGO in Kenya to actually be implemented at scale, it worked at scale if an NGO did it, and it didn't work at scale if the government did it. So saying contract teachers work to raise learning is not a conceivable statement that can be made independent of organizational context. So this evidence-based policy stuff, and a lot of the experiments, what they actually find is that the organization can't do anything. So a lot of the finding, and these aren't written up very often because it's not very interesting, but a huge fraction of the attempts to do experiments on policy conclude by saying we couldn't get the government to implement the policy, or we couldn't get the agency to implement the policy. So coming back to Justin, they did an experiment about whether paralegals going out to villages would improve like access to justice in Liberia. And, the paper now shows that when paralegal goes out, it does improve things. The first part of the experience was 6 months into implementing it, the paralegals weren't going out. So the real difficult issue was getting the paralegals to go out, not necessarily what would happen if I were able to get paralegals to go out. And again, the Band-Aids on a corpse, we might have believed getting nurses attendance would raise health outcomes, but we couldn't get nurses attendance up. A recent set of experiments about what would improve policing in Rajasthan basically found we can't make the police in Rajasthan do anything. That was the finding. So it wasn't that with and without the experiment made any difference, so we couldn't say what the impact of the experiment was. And again, on and on, where it's the lack of the capability to do anything is what the finding of the attempt to do the evidence-based policy is. Okay, so it wouldn't be a Lant Pritchett seminar if I didn't show you some picture of some animal. So part of the issue is the existing theories of change as a development of state capability are wrong about what will work, and worse, they're wrong about what will work, but they allow successful failure. That is, they allow you to fail again and again and again, and still succeed in calling yourself a post office. So countries that aren't delivering the mail still have a post office. Now, how many of you have ever been to a country where the police, there's no corruption in the police force? Or how many of you have been to a country where there is corruption in the police force? Right? Okay. If you haven't, you shouldn't be in the room because you're not really working in development. Okay? How many of you have been in a country where the policemen don't routinely wear uniforms? What was that? Where the police don't wear uniforms. No, routinely. Most policemen wear uniforms. Okay. So what's the role of police uniforms? It isn't to help you enforce the law, because many of these people wearing uniforms are in fact corrupt. The uniforms are camouflage. They make it look like you're a police force that might in fact be engaged in the function of enforcing the law, and hence enhances your survival value. So there's this snake that's very venomous, and it's got red, black, and yellow stripes. And then there's this snake that's got red, black, and yellow stripes that has not venom. Who needs venom, right? As long as I can deter people from eating me by looking like a venomous snake, why all the bother of being venomous, right? So the problem is that isomorphic mimicry, just mimicking the function, the characteristics of successful organizations, can actually be a part of a survival value where you can successfully fail. You can fail at accomplishing your objective and yet succeed in attracting resources and budgets and staff for decades and decades. So part of the danger of the transplantation plus time passes plus build capacity theories is that you can do this forever and not succeed and yet not fail at your continued lack of failure. So, and it's a reasonable strategy as long as you're in an environment where it works. By the way, this is if you confront these snakes, red and black, friend of Jack, red and yellow, kill a fellow. So if the red touches the yellow, you should run away. If the red touches the black, you're okay. Which just reinforces how many of you are going to follow that algorithm if you see the snake. You're all going to run away from both of them, right? It's like you're going to see red, yellow, and black and go, I remember Lant Pritchett saying something. No, just run. So isomorphic is successful for a reason, right? It's like a bother to try and differentiate functional from non-functional snakes. So now so our theory, and by our I mean Michael Wilcock and Matt Andrews and I have written a set of papers in which we have a theory of capability in which we kind of stand on its head the existing kind of developmental theories. So our view is that a lot of the existing sort of things map from your theory to your strategy to your tactics, And if you work back from the tactics being pursued to what the strategy is, to what the underlying theory is, a lot of the theory is that high-functioning organizations build success. So we know that developed countries have post offices that work. And so we know a successful post office delivers the mail. So if we think how we're going to build these successful organizations, we assume that if we build the organization, we will have success in the function of the organization. And our theory is success builds institutions. So rather than thinking, let's build an organization that looks like a successful post office, let's choose a feasible problem in delivering the mail and solve that problem, and then build the organization up from the cumulative process of discovering how to solve concrete problems our organization faces. At the end of the day, we will have a successful organization. But we won't have built the successful organization by building a successful organization. The successful organization will have been built from successes which become embedded and embodied in practices of the organization. But the practices come from solving concrete problems. So in this theory, you cannot separate out knowledge and learning from organizational capability. Organizational capability is built by learning how to solve problems. Right? Now my analogy for this, or I don't know, this isn't an analogy, but this is a rhyming phrase, because I've learned from long experience in the field of migration that rhyming is really important. I mean, after all, how many of you have heard of brain drain? Right? Why have you heard of brain drain? Because there's any empirical evidence for brain drain? No. It's because brain and drain rhyme. So, given my importance of rhyming, I'm going to say a key lesson that we want to say is you can't juggle without the struggle. Meaning, let's say I want to build the capability to juggle, right? Which I have built. Then the thing is that let's say I have this capability to juggle, these 3 oranges, right? Now, if I want to transfer the capability to juggle to someone who doesn't juggle, Okay, I can see by the people coming mad already, right? I could think that I could explain to Marla how to juggle, right? Because she's a high-capacity individual. And I could say things like, well, the key to juggling is we're going to reduce a set of steps, toss it from this hand when this, when this orange is at its apex. It's time to toss it to the other hand and catch it in the other hand. So it's very simple. It's toss. When that is its peak, toss the other one and catch it. And then repeat, right? That's juggling. How hard can that be? Okay. But the point is that the capacity, and then once I have the capability to juggle, I start with juggling easy things. These things are easy to juggle because they're easy to toss, they're reliable in the air. Then I could maybe juggle more harder things. Like marshmallows are harder to juggle because they're less reliable trajectories in the air of tossing, but I can still kind of juggle marshmallows. And then I might want to juggle a set of completely disparate objects, right? My book, a moose and a thing. And I'll be honest, ex ante, I can't juggle these things because it's just a higher level of capability to juggle those 3 things than to juggle these 3 things than to juggle these 3 things. But what's the point? The point isn't I can juggle. It's not all about me. The point is you can't separate out the capability to juggle from having acquired the set of performative actions of actually juggling. The abstract knowledge of how to juggle isn't the capability to juggle and can't be transmitted in that way. So now, therefore, to get to a successful organization, the organization has to produce successes. And then the process of producing the successes acquires the capability that gets embedded in organizational patterns of behavior, which then can result in further successes. So, So I'm going to skip some things. So we have developed a kind of alternative theory of organizational capability. And I want to stress that we don't mean, what we are trying to do is not create a new exclusive, this is right and everybody else is wrong theory about how to do this. What we're trying to create is a rubric that's descriptive of how lots of other people are talking about it. We're trying to encompass the existing theories rather than collapse the existing theories at this stage. And our kind of descriptive acronym, and again, things have to rhyme and you have to have an acronym of 4 letters or less, is PDIA, Problem-Driven Iterative Adaptation. And essentially this is just, we need local solutions for local problems, which means to build organizational capability, we have to have the organization nominate problems that it wants to solve of the type it can solve. And again, these all might seem to be kind of platitudes, but it's in fact the exact opposite of the way development now works. So it's local solutions for local problems, pushing problem-driven positive deviance, which is creating an authorizing environment in which non-standard attempts to solve the problem are allowed. Learn, iterate, and adapt. Have a feedback mechanism that learns which of these positive deviants is solving the problem. And then ultimately you're going to scale these practices through organizational diffusion. Meaning not, what I mean by diffusion is diffusion, not a top-down process of what the brain learns and the fingers follow the instruction of the brain, but it actually diffuses across the organization in a horizontal way. So the first thing is local solutions for local problems, and there it's defining the problem in ways that's problem-driven, not solution-driven, whereas a huge amount of what we do in development is define the problem as the lack of the solution. So the problem with procurement is you're not following our procurement procedures. That's the problem to be solved. Well, no. That's a solution to be adapted. Because you don't start from saying the problem with our procurement procedures is 40% of the money is stolen, or all the budget gets spent in the last quarter of the fiscal year, or I can't reliably procure things in a timely basis, so I go half the year without my textbooks. That's a problem. The lack of following procedures is a potential solution to that problem, but only one of many potential solutions. So you want to be problem-driven, not solution-driven, and local problems, not global problems. So a problem people in that environment really care and want to solve. Which may not be, just kind of to choose a controversial example since I shy away from controversy, but it may well be, in Afghanistan, having a gender strategy is not a locally nominated problem. The donors might want Afghanistan to have a gender strategy, but that doesn't make it a local problem to which people are actually actively going to search for solutions. Then the second step, and I'm going to kind of skip this entirely, but then once you've nominated a problem, you have to ask yourself, what kind of problem is it that I have? Meaning, what kinds of activities would it take for me to solve that problem? And we have like a 4-fold analytical criteria that breaks out into 5 kinds of activities. Implementation like, which is like policy changes that are self-implementing. If I devalue the exchange rate's devalued. It doesn't take a ton of capacity to implement a new policy of devaluation. So this is policy or kind of concentrated elite services. I mean, I take this from India where the Supreme Court works really well unless the legal system is a morass of corruption, right? So you can run a Supreme Court, but you can't necessarily run a police force, right? Second is logistics. It could well be that your problem requires activities from your organization that are logistical. And by logistical, we basically mean it's going to take a lot of people, but you could reduce what each one of them does to an algorithm, in which the state of the world mapping to the action they required is really simple. So vaccination is a logistical task. You grab a little kid and you put the thing in their mouth, in their arm, and they're vaccinated. you don't have to have a ton of like sophistication in it. I mean, it's better if you do. And health experts in the room are like steam coming out of their ears, but it's simple, right? Then you've got implementation-intensive service delivery, and I should cut the word policy, screw policy there, which is like ambulatory curative care. You really do need the agent to like do the right thing in the right time to the right patient. You can't like have an algorithm description of what the doctor should be doing. It depends, right? And we can't have an algorithm description of what teachers should be doing. It depends. And you can't have an algorithmic description necessarily of what regulators should be doing in complex regulatory environments. Well, sorry. Then there's implementation-intensive imposition of obligations, which is like collecting taxes. And this, different kinds of taxes, but this would be collecting corporate taxes. And then there's problems we call wicked hard. And actually, we don't call them wicked hard, we call them wicked hard, because we developed this theory in Boston. Thought like that. And what wicked hard means is wicked doesn't mean evil, it just means really, right? And these are problems where it's kind of implementation intensive and we really don't know what the agent should do. So like weight loss programs. We can all agree it would be better if many of us lost weight. Not going to point any fingers, but I could lose some weight, right? That said, having a like reliable program for weight loss is very difficult because we actually don't have a very good theory of how agents of weight loss programs induce other people to behave in ways that they lose weight. So this is a wicked hard problem. It's not even implementation intensive. It's not even like I kind of know what the teacher should do in a variety of contexts that I could write down in a handbook. Here we're not even clear that there's a science of this. Okay. So the second step is you have to authorize positive deviation. Okay. And again, have to have at least 2 animal pictures, turns out. So let's say we want an organization to solve a problem. We have to get, one theory of organizational improvement that's become quite popular is that we're going to beat them into it. People outside the organization are going to put pressure on the organization to do what it's supposed to do, and that outside pressure will result in the organization improving. That's a theory, right? But it wouldn't be a good theory of how turtles are going to move. Because if you start beating on a turtle, what does the turtle do? Pulls the arms, legs, and head in. Once he has pulled his arms, legs, and head in, the turtle won't move. And B, the turtle has survived in its evolutionary form for thousands of years because beating on it, you will tire of beating on it before it tires of having a shell. Right? So the existing organizations in the world that have dysfunctional outcomes have hard shells. You are not going to reform the police of Rochester by beating on the police force from the outside. A, don't be bad. B, because then even the people inside the organization that are potentially reform champions of police reform are more likely to pull their head in response to external threats than have their head out trying to move while blows are raining down on their organization. So you got to get somebody in the organization to stick their neck out. Somebody in the organization has to want to move. Right? So that's what we mean by authorizing positive deviation. And now I'm going to really skip stuff because these are really cool slides that one of my MPID students built. And you can tell a student built it because saw how that moved like that. That's well beyond my capability. But I'm going to get to section 2, which is, let's say we've nominated a problem. So now we're ready to talk about MeE. So what are we talking about? We're talking about building organizational capability to solve problems in an environment in which we've now nominated a problem for which there's some local constituencies for a solution. We've created an environment in which some people are authorized to do things to solve that problem. Meaning they can hire some staff, they can spend some money, they can expend some inputs. And now we want to talk about how would we go about creating a structure whereby those people move towards implementing effective policy. Okay? Well, ME&E, or MeE, stands for monitoring, experiential learning, and impact evaluation. So what we want to do is integrate the processes of, so if we think of a generic description of a development project is it transforms inputs into activities, into outputs that produce outcomes that have impacts. So this describes building a road, this describes building a power plant, this describes an information campaign to improve accountability, this describes anything you want to describe as a development project roughly has this generic structure that you're going to turn some inputs. They could be human resources, they could be money, they could be some combination, they have to be some combination, but into a set of activities that those agents. Now, this little circle is kind of the organization. So this happens inside the organization. This happens outside the organization. So microcredit activity would turn inputs and activities into outputs, which would be loans, which then there would be a positive behavioral theory of the intended beneficiaries and their environment, that those outputs would translate into positive outcomes and impacts. But there's two key positive theories. One is your positive model of, if I were able to produce these outputs, what would be the impact and outcomes? The second is, what's your causal model of the behavior of your agents, such that your organization qua organization will translate inputs and activities into outputs. Now, for effective policy, we need both. We need to be effective, and then hopefully what we're effective at is also effective policy. See what I'm saying? So we can have a policy, which is a mapping, but if we can't implement it, we don't arrive at these outputs, which means we don't arrive at the outcomes, even if in the counter-factual case of were we able to arrive at the outputs, they would lead to the good outcomes. So a not implemented good policy isn't a good policy. Right? If you lack, meaning I could lack a theory, I could lack a correct theory of what outputs would lead to outcomes, but I could lack a correct theory of what was going to lead inputs to produce outputs. And developmental failures consist of both. Right? The main way of getting at this issue is among others, but among many others, but at least one that's now very popular, is ex post impact evaluation. Right? But we also need to know about this, and what we have done is we think that monitoring data helps us do this. Right? So I put these slides in the wrong order. Or actually, so this is in the wrong order. So now we want to think through what is the sequence of events that would be an ME&E approach to implementing a project in a way that would build the capability for implementing effective policy, which is simultaneously finding out what's an effective policy and building the capability to implement it. So the first thing is you reverse engineer from goals back to instruments. Meaning you start with your problem, and then you say, what are the many ways in which my problem could be solved? What are the instruments at my disposal? What's the problem I have? I come up and I design a project where I have designed the project by working backwards from my problem, two sets of solutions that are available to me as an organization. That's what a project design is, right? And then there's step 3. And it turns out step 3 is the hardest step of all. Step 3 is admit that the project you have just designed, you don't know whether or not it will work. Right? And this is like, I've never been in a 12-step program. But one of the steps, you've been in one of the steps, I've heard, is admit you have a problem. And that often turns out to be like the hardest step. Because unless you take that step, I can tell you what all the other steps are, but unless you've really internalized and admitted that first step, the rest of the steps are just academic, right? And it turns out in the development space, it's much more popular to claim you know for sure what will work and to advocate others should give you resources on the basis of your claims than it is to say, I have a really serious problem that I would really love to help you solve, and I don't know what the answer is. unfortunately, that third step is key to actually being effective. Because otherwise, you're just going to skip from design the project to implementing a project and then rely on the long, years-long process of evaluation to prove you wrong eventually. Okay. So let's say we do admit we don't know what will work. Then what we want to do is identify the key dimensions of the design space. So let's go back to our problem and say, what are the elements of the design space? And I'm sorry I'm skipping back and forth, but I somehow got these slides in the wrong order. So let's say we've decided that we want every child to reach grade 3 able to read. That's our problem. And notice that this problem is well defined. It's not improve quality of education. And there could be lots of other problems in the space of education. This is one we're going to nominate. We want every child to reach grade 3 able to read fluently. That's our problem. And we think of solutions. And in that solution space, we say, well, we need to train teachers. Okay? Great. We need to train teachers in order to accomplish this. Then we want to think, what are all the ways in which we can train teachers? Well, let's just think of 3 elements of the design space for a teacher training program. Right? One is the location of the training. The location can be in school, or it can be teachers come to a central location and get trained. So we can have in-school training, not. What's the content of the training? Well, we could have pedagogical content, or we could have subject matter content. Meaning we could train teachers how to teach reading, or we could actually improve their reading skills. Right? And again, all of this is like, I'm going to make the point in a second, all of this is like super simplistic. And then the third is, how do we do follow-up of the training? Do we do follow-up in classroom observation of the trainers now coming to the school, or do we do follow-up by teachers come back to training in 6 months? Okay. Now, even this is like absurdly simplified, and instead of the idea that we have a teacher training program, we have 8 possible programs. Because the point is, the design space blows up in combinatorics on you. So if you, and I really inserted some other slides that I wanted to have in here, but I don't. But I must have sent the wrong file. Anyway, even if you like think of a program that people say there's lots of evidence about now, which is a conditional cash transfer. A conditional cash transfer is a class, and any given conditional cash transfer is an instance of the class. Okay? How many different conditional cash transfer programs are there? Well, if you think that's how many elements are there in the design space. Well, in a conditional cash transfer, easily there's at least 10 key dimensions of its design. There's how much is the transfer going to be? Who is the transfer going to go to? What's the transfer going to be conditioned on? How are we going to do the targeting of the transfer? I mean, how are we going to target the households to get the transfer? Who is going to certify compliance of the household with the conditions of the transfer? What is the financial mechanism? How frequently do we give the transfer? Do we give it annually? Do we give it daily? Do we give it monthly? Okay? At least 10 or 11 different dimensions, each of which has at least 3 or 4 different legitimately perfectly debatable possibilities. I mean, it's not like you have to make stuff up, oh, we could do it in this crazy way. It's like in the design of the project, somebody has to decide among perfectly debatable alternatives of the design of the CCT. So really you have on the order of tens of thousands of CCT designs at your disposal at any given time. Okay? So the design space is super hyperdimensional. You're making choices without tons and tons of information. Because even if you know for sure Progressa work, which isn't as obvious as you might think, but even say you think you know that, that provides you almost zero guidance in choosing among the 10,000 possible elements of the CCT space. Right? So what we argue you want to do is think about how rugged is your fitness, how rugged is the fitness function over your design space. Meaning, let's say we've got 2 possible design parameters, and I'm just choosing 2 design parameters because that makes it for a 3-dimensional diagram. And this would be the outcome measured in the metric of my solving my problem from these different designs. It could well be that I'm really lucky and my design space is completely non-interactive and completely linear. So it doesn't matter. The return to doing option C versus A is the same whether I'm doing 1, 2, or 3 and vice versa. Non-interactive, superlinear. But if your fitness space, which is the outcome you're going to get, is interactive and rugged, meaning different combinations of design interact to produce different results, then this, mapping available evidence to what should be done in a specific context gets really hard. Because it doesn't matter that we have 3 other CCTs. If the space of return over impact over CCT is contextual and rugged, we kind of need to learn for ourselves. So what we want to think is we're going to crawl over the available design space. So what we're going to do is we are going to specify ex ante which are the possible options, and this comes from some of our MPID students at Harvard, where you think about the feasibility of options and their supportability and their likely returns, and then think so rather than thinking of we're going to implement a project, and the project is designed and can be procured and specified of what everyone in the project is going to do over the next 5 years, the project is the approval of a process of moving through a sequential set of design space alternatives. So we could think of our sort of design space alternatives as being, we're going to choose, and we're not going to be able to implement all 8 projects at once. We're going to implement the best possible project as one of the default projects, and then we're going to implement variants of that project that we think are an interesting part of the design space to explore. Then we're going to use our monitoring data, our real-time, high-frequency data on inputs, activities, and outputs to see which of those projects is working best relative to our assumed theory of change. We're not testing our theory of change yet. We're just testing getting to the outputs in our theory of change. So are we getting change in teacher behavior? Are we getting teachers to actually apply what we think are better teaching practices? Whether kids are learning, we still have to measure and we still have to do an evaluation of. But the first step is, are we getting teachers to change their behavior and applying the skills? And then we think through a sequence whereby the information from our M data, not from E data, not from big evaluation data, from our M data, are feeding back into the pre-specified decisions about project implementation. Meaning, ex ante, we told you what sequence we were going to try things in, right? And then we told you on what criteria we would choose to scale up or scale down given alternatives. And then what we're doing is sequencing through that. Okay? So the final thing is, depending on what you're doing, you want to think about how what you learn is going to diffuse. And our argument is that for these kinds of activities, learning is going to be diffusion anyway. So unless you learned in this way, you don't have any reliable model of scaling the learning. Meaning, crudely put, teachers are going to change their practices when they're convinced their practices are better, not because you tell them to do something else. This is partly evidence, this is partly my wife's teaching. But, so, when have teachers learned about what better practices are? Well, when they have participated in a process where they feel they have learned it. And if you want to change behavior on a large scale about reasonably complex things, you probably need to think of a learning process in which people learn about what works from either having done it themselves or learning from someone they trust about what works. So an ME&E is an approach to learning and building organizational capability, particularly in these kinds of organizations. It's conceivable you can do learning in these kinds of organizations in a different way. And I think we have evidence that we can narrow down certain problems and make it so we only need 5 or 6 people in the country to understand it and we can still get it right. But that's not true of teaching, that's not true of policing, that's not true of building roads, that's not true of maintaining water systems, that's not true of nearly everything else. And then let me just wrap up by saying, so what I want to emphasize is a lot of this was background, but the background was to understand what ME and E isn't. ME and E isn't just kind of a different way to do projects because we want a different way to do projects, and it's not a different way of doing research because we're tired of doing impact evaluations. ME and E is we start from a different theory of building capability of organizations to accomplish tasks primarily in the public sector. We're not really worried about private sector organizations. We want to then extend the notion of using experimentation to inside the organization. So rather than being exclusively focused on what the right policy is and outputs to outcomes mapping, we're really much more worried about building capability to get from inputs to outputs. And we extend the notion of randomization inside the organizational processes, rather than being external evaluation of your organization's outputs. We premise on the need that we need, for this to work, we need rapid and many evaluations. If you need rapid and many evaluations, they have to be fast and cheap. And you can't make big E fast and cheap. You can't make impact evaluation fast and cheap. But ME and E can be fast and cheap because it's an integral part of otherwise organizational processes. So if you just take what you're spending on M and reorient it in an ME and E framework, the incremental costs of little e are small because the fixed costs of M are there anyway. I hope people are understanding what I'm saying, but we can talk about it later if you don't. So it's premised on the need that in order to get to effective policy where fitness spaces are rugged, we need behavioral change from lots of people, and fitness spaces are contextual, we need to have a lot of crawl over the design space, which means we need rapid crawl over lots of alternatives simultaneously. And then finally, you can't juggle without the struggle. In order to get your organizational agents to change their behavior and learn, by which we mean that the agents do something different, they have to learn. And to learn, they have to be engaged in the practice of learning themselves, and hence it's really difficult to separate out knowledge and practice, and our argument is that practice builds knowledge, not vice versa. So I'm done.
Thank you very much. Let's go right to our I have just a couple of pictures to show. Do you know how to get over? I can get there. I mean virtually.
To make the computer
virtual space.
I assume this is idiot-proof, but that's rarely a good idea.
Let's test it.
Yeah.
That's part of this other one here. I hate doing this when people are watching.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's a little bit like tying your shoes when people are watching. You do it just fine in private, but if somebody asks you to do it in public, it's different. So thanks. It's always a pleasure to discuss Lant. Start with the obvious disclaimer: I can't juggle. I can't play the cello either, so I don't feel as badly vis-a-vis Lant. But as it happens, my son plays the cello, so maybe doing well there. I wanted to say just a couple of things about the paper, and since Lant only talked partly about the paper that was circulated, I'm only going to talk partly about the paper that Lant circulated and base my comments on some stuff that I've been doing as well that I think is related. Because, so the first thing is I'd like to try to make a practical observation on what this process of mid-course corrections and crawling around design space and so on might look like in reality. Because I'm sort of struck by Lant. So Lant's a lot older than I am, and I've noticed that as you get older, you write papers with more words and less numbers. And sometimes you get to the point where you write papers with animals in them. So what I thought would be useful is to show numbers. Okay, so these are real numbers. that require a little bit of explanation, but I think they're kind of helpful in thinking through some of the things that Lant has been talking about crawling design space. So this this picture I made at 11:15 this morning in somewhat of a hurry, but it's based on a research project that I've been working on that has one paper already with Danny Kaufman and Cevdet Denizer that looks at sort of factors associated with the success of individual World Bank projects. Which sounds sort of horribly dry and boring. But there's actually a whole bunch of interesting stuff in here, and I want to share one bit with you. So, World Bank projects, right? These are, the World Bank does many, many of them. I'm going to start with a sample of 3,764 projects. There's over 10,000 World Bank projects, so this is a subset for which some of the relevant data is available. World Bank projects take a long time to do. So the median World Bank project is 6 years from approval to its sort of final administrative evaluation. Okay? So this is approval, and over here is evaluation. And on average, you can think that it takes 6 years to get from here to there. Okay? This is a subset of projects that actually take at least 4 years to do. And you'll see why in a second. So this is the first half of the project. This is the second half of the project. So this period here is at least 2 years, and this period here is at least 2 years as well. It's whatever the project is divided in half. Now, World Bank projects start off with an objective, right? Much like what Lant is talking about. And then at the end of the day, there's this largely administrative process of deciding whether the project met the objective or not. We have lots of discussions about whether the objectives make sense, or whether the process for coming up at whether they were successful in meeting these objectives makes sense or not. But let's sort of take that at face value and think about the process of mid-course corrections that actually sort of is happening. So these are projects that have been implemented over the last 15 years or so at the World Bank. Okay, so the overall sort of success rate of projects in this sample is 71%. I don't have a view whether that's high or low, that's just the metric by which success is being evaluated. But there are sort of different paths to different outcomes, and that's what the rest of the graph is trying to show. So the way that I separate out projects in the first half and the second half here is by another aspect of how the World Bank implements projects. So in principle, this sort of crawling of the design space and so on goes on, right? Because task managers of projects on a regular basis, at least annually and sometimes more often, have to take stock of the project and say, is this project in trouble, or is this project not in trouble? If it's in trouble, it gets flagged as a problem project. So I have information on whether each of these 3,764 projects was flagged as a problem project in the first half of its life, and whether it was flagged as a problem in the second half of its life, and then what the ultimate success rate is for the sort of 2x2 combination of possibilities. Right, so what happened? In the first half of a project's life, about a quarter of them get flagged as problems. Okay? And so this is where the little e, the experiential kind of learning part should happen. So, and then 75% of them, they're doing fine in the first half. So let's look at the 25% that aren't doing fine in the first half. What happens to those? Well, you can ask, were they flagged as a problem in the second half of the project, or did some stuff happen that turned the project around into something that is not a problem? So it's either a problem project, or I just said good because good is shorter than not problem. So, what's kind of interesting, first of all, is that in reality, problematic status is very persistent, right? So at the beginning, sort of blank slate of new projects, 25% are problems. Once they're problems in the first half, fully 63% of those continue to be problems in the second half. And not surprisingly, the sort of success rate is much lower than the average success rate. Again, I'm not quite sure what it means, that 41% success rate for problems that in the second half of their life we thought were a problem. Maybe really great stuff happened in the last little bit of the project, and so that, I don't know, that's something with the metric. But the point here, though, is that in reality, maybe this crawling doesn't happen, and I think this is why Lant is so excited about it, and this is why I think it's important, because you have this high persistence. What you would really hope is that, I think it's absolutely fine that a bunch of projects go here initially, right? If they don't, you're not taking risks. The interesting thing is, do you have a lot of projects that are going from here to here? And the answer is, well, maybe there could be more. But the other thing to keep in mind, though, is that learning is kind of a symmetric thing. You don't just learn from successes. You also learn, or from failures, I should say. You should also learn from successes, but be careful about them. And this is what I think is interesting here. When you look at the projects that in the first half turn out to be successful, that are not flagged as a problem, so they're good projects, in the second half, actually more of them turn out being flagged as problems than at the beginning. So here 25% get flagged as problems. If you're not flagged as a problem in the first half, there's actually a higher risk of being flagged as a problem in the second half than there was initially. Okay? And finally, in terms of outcomes, well, as we sort of expect, when projects aren't a problem, in particular when projects aren't a problem over the whole course of their life, they turn out to be sort of successful by the metrics that they use. So I think sort of tracing how projects go through this process is going to be one way ultimately of evaluating whether this sort of crawling process that Lant is advocating is actually happening. So I thought this was useful as a way of kind of showing how you might tell whether an organization is doing this well or not. The second point that I want to make is that, and so this was kind of I was trying to think of a cute title. I was going to make my presentation, it's all about him instead of all about me. But instead I tell it, it's all about me and what else, in the sense of, well, what exactly is it that we should be monitoring, especially at this first step when you're thinking about how a project is developing within an institution? Okay? And I have a couple of points to make within here, right? The one is that what Lant has been focused on a lot is sort of these different processes that go into the design space. So there are A's and B's, alphas and betas, Roman numeral 1, Roman numeral 2, each of which corresponds to this sort of technical element of a project. But there are lots of other elements that are important for projects. And one of them that I want to flag is something that, again, has sort of come out of this research that I've been doing with Chevdet and Danny on projects. It's got nothing to do with any of these sort of technical design ingredients, but it has to do with who's actually in charge of the project. I mean, it's one thing who's the president of the World Bank. It's another thing who is in charge of the teacher training project in Kenya that Lant is talking about in this stylized way. So let me just show you something. So these are all projects. All these blue dots are projects, right? And projects are rated in their outcomes on a scale of 1 to 6. So these are really bad projects, and these are really good projects up here. And on the horizontal axis here, this is one other design ingredient in a project from the World Bank, which is an international organization's perspective, which is, where do you do it? Are we going to do this in countries with good policy or countries with bad policy? So on the horizontal axis here, for each project, I calculate what is the average quality of policy in the country during the time period that the project was implemented. And what do you see? Well, better countries with better policy have better projects on average, which is sort of great. This is sort of, how impressed should you be by this picture? Well, this is sort of a t-statistic of about 3. And now I'm going to show you another t-statistic of about 3 that relates project outcomes to another ingredient, which is who is in charge of the project. And so here, at first glance, this graph looks sort of weird. It looks like these old sort of genetic tests where they get genes to migrate along a strip of gel, right? But it's the same graph. So we have project outcomes here. On the horizontal axis, what I do is I look at the task managers responsible for the project and ask, how successful were they on all their other projects? Not the one in question, but all the other projects that they've done. So this is this very crude measure of the quality of the person who's responsible for implementing the project. This is also an upward sloping relationship, although it may not quite look as visually impressive as the other one. This is about a t-statistic of 3. And the sort of standardized magnitudes of the slopes are roughly the same, and the share of the variation are roughly about the same as what you saw in the previous graph. Okay, so there are many different ingredients that you need to think about when you're crawling the design space. One of them, I would add, is to say, not just the country where you're doing it, which is part of the design space, but also who you're putting in charge of doing it. Then the last thing, sorry, that's just the title of the paper. I'll leave this here because it's more interesting to look at. The last thing I was just thinking about as I was walking up here, and so this is a deeply unpolished observation, but I was thinking about something that I read in the New York Times this morning about the 787 Dreamliner. Right, so this is this big new carbon fiber jet that Boeing makes, and has just gone into service last year. And in the last couple of days, one of them in Boston, coincidentally, caught fire on the runway, and another one was taxiing, ready to take off, and fuel was streaming out of its tank in a way that was not supposed to be doing it, so it had to get towed back and get fixed up. And so what does this have to do with projects? Well, sometimes we're very self-centered in the development community. We think all the time, these are these really hard projects, these are really hard outcomes we have to get to, and how are we going to organize ourselves to do it? How do we know what success looks like? And then you sort of step back and stop looking quite so closely at your navel, and you say, the private sector does really complicated projects all the time, like building a 787 Dreamliner. That's way more complicated than most of the projects that the World Bank does, I'd say. And yet, somehow, there's one thing that's really, well, there's many things that are different about building a jet and doing a development project. But the one that I was thinking of that I think relates to what Lant is talking about, and that I wanted to toss out as food for thought, is that when the private sector builds a jet, there is one ultimate metric of success that is unambiguous and that you can measure, and that is, does Boeing make money selling these jets? Right? So part of the problem, I think, with development projects that makes them harder is that, and that even makes this whole process of crawling the design space hard, is that even when you get to the end, it's actually quite hard to measure exactly what success is in an unambiguous way. And so you can imagine sort of the engineer crawling the design space of a jet, and they have this pretty good idea that if we put in really expensive seats, then we're going to make less profits down the road on this jet. Or if we do this really inexpensively, we're going to make more profits down the road. We have that mapping, I think, less clearly in development projects. That doesn't mean, though, that I think we should think about attaching to each development project a single indicator of success, because you can easily imagine that when you do that, you create all kinds of crazy incentives. If the only thing we care about post offices is whether they can return misaddressed letters, and that's the only thing you reward, you're going to get post offices that are really good at that and nothing else. So I don't have a conclusion on this. I got here, and so my walk concluded rather than my thought process about this. But it somehow seems to me, I guess it's more of a qualification in terms of what Lant was talking about, which is that, yes, you can sort of, so you think about those like two-dimensional bar graphs that Lant was showing where you have this element of the design space, this element of the design space, how rugged is it? I guess my point is that it's really hard to measure what's on the vertical axis, even if you buy into everything that Lant has been talking about. It's not like we just have profits on the vertical axis and we just know that this kind of jet is more profitable than this kind of jet. What's on that vertical axis is really hard to measure, and we should put a lot more thought and resources into doing that. Okay, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you very much to both of you. So in 4 minutes, it's the end of our scheduled time. We said that we were going to finish at 1:30. But if the two of you could stay maybe 10 or 15 minutes, both of you? Yes, Lant has lunch right here. We could have just a couple rounds of questions for both of you. And because the scheduled time has run out, I hereby remove the social sanction against walking out of the room. But if you can stay, I think it'll be a great discussion. Maybe we could start with April and then to open up the wall.
Thanks. I've read the earlier version of this paper, and I think this is really important and provocative stuff. So not at all to debate any of the points, but more to sort of push you toward thinking about how to test your theory. So it occurs to me, if this really is a better approach to finding approaches to solving problems, then in the countries that developed faster in the past, we should see examples of this. And I can think of some that might be that, but I'm just wondering, have you or do you know of anyone who's sort of taken this, or can you get your students at the Kennedy School to do this sort of work, to go back and say, okay, and here's an example. See, they were doing this and it worked better, and you guys should do that, because it's a theory. I find it very compelling, but naturally I'm sitting here thinking, well, this isn't the better.
Do you want to have a round?
Yeah, let's take 3 or 4.
I saw this gentleman.
Lant made a very eloquent argument. There were several parts, and I'm not sure how closely they all went together. He made a very good case on the nomination, and there's a better fitness talking about in terms of it. But I think still, some things that are missing. And I wonder, perhaps if we look at all the things that affect success of world-based projects, if one of them is takes into account how these projects were conceived in the first place. What is it that actually led to this direction? We'll do this with this population. I have a suspicion, if the plan is correct, this matters in the conceived correlation. I'm interested in the Treasury and seeing the World Bank.
Thank you very much. Maybe one more. Oh, please go ahead.
I found myself nodding along sort of the first 3/4 of the paper, so I'm a big believer in this kind of continuous feedback, when you call it evaluative thinking, or I think you usually call it reflective practice. But then I think that the step 4 is sort of specify ex ante your design parameters. I mean, it seems like you shied away from the conclusion, your own arguments a little bit. I mean, if you have these very complicated design spaces, how do you even know where to start specifying 3 or a small number of design parameters? I'm focused on this because I just wonder if we need to think a little more radically about sort of balancing, about bending the tension between adaptability and accountability.
Meaning upend, which way do you think it is now?
Well, I think we're too focused on accountability now. Like you said, you've got to specify all this ahead of time. I guess practically I'm just sort of worried about the eager beaver donor that said, okay, now give me a 4-dimensional block frame. I'm stuck with that same
That's right, yeah.
issue.
Okay.
You want to take those?
Yeah. So the first question on evidence is, I think, in the papers we argue that if you look at the ways in which the now developed countries came to have the organizations and institutions they have, it looks a lot more like PDIA if you really look at the history than if you look at the mythos. So if you look at the history of part of the difficulty is that every successful organization, not every, but nearly every successful organization thrives on a myth, right? A central driving vision, purpose, myth, including often a Garden of Eden foundational myth, right? It's like, here's how we came to be who we are. That is completely at odds with the reality, right? So the post office doesn't triumph either internally or externally its own history. It triumphs, so we're here to deliver the mail, and we deliver the mail in the best way possible, and we tell a triumphalist story about the way in which the organization came to be, rather than a tinkering story, like a whole bunch of historical contingencies, and we're under pressure for this, so we did that, and it turns out we can get leverage from this, so we did more of that. So, to some extent, one of the lines of research we are pursuing is precisely, and Michael has a volume about development and history, is if you look at history, so a lot of the current kind of organizational lessons are completely false because they transplant the existing organization rather than attempting to think of transplantation of the historical process that brought that organization into being. So I think part of our evidence is now developed countries really did tinker their way towards success much more than current countries are, because we weren't burdened by other people's success. I'm in America. But like when America was developing its post office, or its army in 1870, or its customs procedures in 1890, it wasn't burdened by the fact that some other country was doing it radically better already, and hence wasn't burdened by, oh, let's learn the lessons. We had to learn our own lessons. So, okay. Second, we are trying to do exactly what you proposed, because I think it's a great idea. We need more like examples of how this works. But part of the difficulty is really not to be like super Foucault deconstructionist, but organizations do hide their own history. Part of being a successful organization is often creating a mythos about what you're about that hides, in fact, the true social conflict or the true problem orientation from which you emerge. So, anyway, there's more of that. Okay. Second, I think the nomination problem is a very hard problem because we have a lot of rhetoric about nomination. Because in the end, I've moved much more to be concerned about the internal processes of the organization than I was, say, 5 years ago. Which means external nomination of what problems an organization should be working on are important, but unless you have internal buy-in, it's not gonna, it doesn't really have traction. So kind of, you have to have the organization itself be an integral part of the nomination process, which isn't necessarily going to produce what some perfectly technocratic or bottom-up set of procedures would produce. And we kind of, I think we as technocratic economists, experts, often think there's going to be some optimal problem that they should address. And that matching is going to be very much more rough than I think. So, and I'm, again, relative to where I was mentally and intellectually 5 or 6 years ago, I'm much more thinking we should let the police force be an integral part of deciding what the police force is going to get better on, rather than, you know, imagining that we're going to go to the police force with a set of objectives for it. The last thing is, I'm a compromiser, right? So if I thought in the world we didn't have to have a 4-dimensional log frame, and I could just go to DFID or the World Bank or the U.S. Treasury and say, have faith that I'll crawl the design space in a reasonable way, I'd probably go more that direction. So I'm, you know, so I'm trying to be, this is me trying to be practical, right? In the sense of, you know, can I get you to authorize, because relative to the current practice in which aid organizations authorize a single log frame, right? Maybe a project with multiple components, but there's no admission in, so in World Bank documents, I mean, I worked at World Bank for a long time and actually was a TTL of only one project, so I get washed out in the fixed effect arts data. Which, by the way, I was a task manager of a project and then went on leave from the bank from which they hired me to write the evaluation of my project.
And the rating was?
And the rating was, it was fantastic. Yeah, that's right. It was a special land problem. It was a great project. Long story. Anyway, but the upshot is, we're currently, I think you're exactly right, the adaptation versus accountability. In a weird sense, the actual organizations the World Bank and DFID and others work with have zero accountability for performance, but the pressures for accountability of the World Bank and otherwise are narrowing the space for action rather than broadening it, right? So I'm admittedly fighting a compromise battle of, if I could get these organizations to authorize, you know, a log frame that had some possibility that in year 2 we're doing something different depending on what we learned from year 1 and year 2, I would be fantastically happy with that, even though it's like this really modest success. So I am, you know, I'm compromising on that, but yeah, I just am, because I'm trying to be a little bit pragmatic about where we can push organizations. But by the way, I mean, one thing in the bank board approval documents is this component that, like in the template, always was there, called alternatives considered and rejected. Have you ever seen that in project documents? Okay. That section, it's unbelievable. It's often blank now. It's literally blank. I mean, there's a template for the project documents in which, like, perfectly reasonably, they say, what did you consider to solve this problem in the design space besides what you're proposing? And now it's like literally blank in a substantial fraction of projects. So part of the difficulty is the pressure for accountability has led to even kind of narrower space for innovation, because now we want to, like, really, you know, here are our performance targets and here's how we're going to accomplish them, and it just is.
And then we'll get to that.
Well, I wasn't here, and I haven't read the paper, so.
But it's Washington.
But I'm going to, anyway. Yeah, I'm going to be even a little bit, I'll sound a little bit. It just strikes me in everything you just said, and even more everything Art said. This language, the World Bank projects, they're not World Bank projects. They're World Bank finance projects. And so all this discussion about accountability is just, and the log frame, it makes me crazy because it's all about whether the TTL had a good performance. Isn't your paper trying to tell us that the outsiders have to let go a little and somehow find ways to have the implementers of the projects and governments accountable to somebody else? Can you just comment on that in the light of the paper I have read? Or maybe Art wants to. I mean, just the root part of it is, I just really think the whole donor community has to kind of change the mindset around who's responsible for getting the success rate done. And that gets you into all these issues that you're raising so beautifully about that maybe you know, and now you want the World Bank staff, in the case of World Bank finance projects, to add another layer. Well, maybe not. That's the part I don't understand because I didn't hear it. The nomination talk also was about who's. Okay. Then you can just ignore this point if it's completely off the wall.
It's completely off. Completely off. In the sense that the entire paper is never, ever, ever, ever about a donor institution. All of the talk of donor institutions comes as a meta problem. My problem is how do you improve the police force in 11%? How do you improve education?
Okay.
That is a local problem with local solutions. Then there's a meta question of whether or not external agents, of whom we were all mostly external agents to these problems, because we're not working locally, whether we can be constructive. But for us to be constructive, we have to have the right theory of change, of how change is going to happen in Kenya and India. And all of our work is about theories of change that involve Kenya and India and processes in those places, to which external actors are largely irrelevant. And most of my discussion of any external agent is that they're more a part of the problem than part of the solution. And it precisely, so anyway, I mean, we get dragged into discussions about the World Bank just because we're in Washington and we happen to be near it, and because it is potentially a place in which ideas could diffuse about how to do this, but fundamentally, none of the paper, none of the anything is about what the World Bank should do.
It's also an organization to which the same ideas could be turned.
Exactly, and the World Bank could use these same things, but the main thing is you're exactly right. If this sounded like this is a better way for the World Bank to do stuff, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is this is a better way for people in countries who want to build organizational capability of the organizations that are doing stuff, collecting taxes, policing in their countries. What's their theory of change of how they're going to get capable organizations to do that in those settings? And once we have that theory of change, we can then have a meta question of how external actors might inhibit or do that. But and again, art stuff I think is also just doing it with World Bank data because that's kind of what we have, and it's a metaphor for the other problem. But I don't think anybody thinks whether or not you come up to have effective police forces in Kenya 10 years from now is going to, other than super marginally, have anything to do with the rest of the world.
Okay, just a small thing to add to that. I mean, I think to emphasize what Michael said and mine steamrolled over, which is that, you know, at some level the World Bank isn't implementing agency, right? I mean, you know, we're funded by donors to a large extent. I mean, I can't go to my friend Ben and say, Ben, we went to school together. You work for U.S. Treasury now. Can you make sure that Treasury kicks in another $10 billion into IDA the next time around, right? I'd like to do that. Without having a good story about how the World Bank, as an agent on behalf of donors, actually does implement the program. So I think there is a lot of relevance in what I'm saying, even for donor agencies, because again, in the end, the donors are, you know, taxpayers, right? And they hire people like USAID, organizations like the World Bank, to do something, right? We're not just dropping money.
Right, but it's still the same a larger conversation. Is the World Bank implementing the project, or is it?
Well, I mean, de facto, Nancy, come on. Yes. In a lot of places, yes. The World Bank is de facto implementing the project. It's set up. I mean, come on. They set
Maybe
up.
they shouldn't be.
But
Maybe they
that's-
shouldn't be.
or so that's,
Well,
yeah, maybe,
I mean,
okay.
I mean, this is another
That's a
discussion.
larger
Come on, let's not
problem.
be naive about how projects really get implemented.
No, but I think you're shoving together
Yeah.
two different questions, which actually Michael just alluded to, which is that you can apply this framework to
Right.
fixing the police in Rajasthan,
Right.
how to do it, and you can also take it. I mean, the bank is an organization running something,
Exactly.
and if you take this framework and sort of
And the bank.
apply it to what the bank does, are we crawling the design space?
Exactly.
And
like,
the answer is not so much.
not so much. I mean, I literally just this morning was talking to the head of the World Bank's organization for knowledge and learning within its operational units. And the bank as an organization is very much trapped in a, you cannot do step 3 in the World Bank. You cannot admit you don't know. You have to go to the board saying this project's going to have 20% rate of return, even though ex post we know 25% of the time it goes within the first 2 years to being a problem project. So rather than having made Plan B and Plan C that we'll move to as structured contingencies, so what I'm trying to get to is we already know that we have to revisit lots of projects, but rather than there being, and again, we're talking about the World Bank partners, we know, but we could do this completely independent of the government of India or the government of Canada, but we know that there are going to be changes. It's just we don't even think ex ante about what those changes will be. So oftentimes when you go in to fix a problem project, no one has thought through the contingencies in advance. So it's kind of, you're temporizing, which is why I think a lot of them stay crappy projects, because you don't actually have any flexibility in design of reallocating things. So sorry, let's go to other, I responded to that one without taking the bunch. So let's take 3 more.
3 more?
3 more.
Well, Lant
I mean, everybody can walk out if they want. See this guy walking out.
Well, Lant has lunch on his props. The red blouse starts off first, and then at the table, and then in the format.
It's a really interesting presentation. But I guess I probably exceed the age limit to be allowed to do so. But let me just put some time here. First, I think it seems like the processes are much more possible than they were 40 years ago. Okay, because if you look at what we did in development when I didn't have any grandchildren, we were learning by doing. And the concerns I have from what you're saying is that how do you get individuals to give up the fact that they know what the solution is? I can remember when I was very, very junior at UC, looking around for a person to work on a project, and I didn't know what I was doing most. So I finally chose the person who was more interested in what the Ghanaians wanted than they were in using their own discipline and their own tool and defining the problem on the basis of the solution that they had. So this is a really old problem, but it's also a very, in a way, an individual problem. I later was responsible for reviewing bank projects and where there would be differences between what USAID experts thought should be done on terracing in Guyana and what the bank should be done. There was no space for saying, okay, well, let's talk about this. Experts can disagree. So that's another kind of question. But I think the one thing, this goes to the Boeing airplane thing. In the public sector, it's very hard to make mistakes because you get punished. In the private sector, if you make a mistake, you may lose money. I actually was thinking about the BP oil spill when I heard about the airplane because they ended up losing money, but they did it anyway. But leaving aside sort of tragedies like that, if a private sector entity feels that it has made a mistake, they can change their mind relatively quickly and not have to explain too much to anyone, which is, in a way, a model that might be worth looking at. Why is it that in this work we have to be right all the time when we know that we're learning by doing?
Next up, are we good?
Yes, my question is going back to what was said before, that this is not necessarily about the World Bank, but about the police force in some country. But how do you get the police force in that country, or the government in that country, to apply these sort of lessons if you start your presentation with saying that the problem is to get these institutions to do anything in the first place? That because the institutions are the problem themselves.
And in the Greens room.
Yeah, I just sort of wanted to echo that point about the private sector and about donors a little bit. When you talked about Little Leah, I couldn't help but thinking about Silicon Valley startups, right? Like a lot of this, rapid prototyping and sort of like black box prototyping, those are things that are being done. But the big difference is they're working with venture capitalists, right, not donors. And honestly, I think they would be very happy to see a 70% project success rate. They accept failure as part of the sector. I think for us it's a little different, and when we talk about evaluation, a lot of times the donors basically prove to me that you were successful, right? Not evaluate what you're doing, but show me why I should support you. So I guess that's my question for you, is how do we change the culture? Like, in order to change the culture within the organization, incentives need to be structured correctly for that organization, and how do we change our sector in that way?
Closing thoughts?
So, if I had the answers to all these questions, I'd be famous, and the price would be higher for a seminar. But I think these are exactly the right sets of questions. I do think the processes have, in some sense, become more ossified rather than less ossified, in the sense that there's less space for actually real innovation now, because we keep doubling down our bets that, well, we know that the post office should look like this, and so the longer we go with a failed post office, rather than entertain the notion of something really different, the more we kind of force it to be compliant. Now, so the question is, how do you change the culture? And the answer is, well, this is what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do is change the culture with a different approach, emphasizing that the existing approach is failing, and then what we mean, one of the things we skipped over was creating a space for positive deviation. And I think the part of what we say in the larger kind of thing on positive deviation is you have to acknowledge that the space for positive deviation can only at any given time be a small part of what the organization is doing. So we're not saying change your entire police force or change your entire schooling system to be flexo, changeo, adaptable experimentation. We're saying authorize a limited number of people within the organization to solve concrete problems, right? So when you say, how do you get the police to agree? If you go in to a police force saying, we're here to do system-wide reform and blah, 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 again, organizations are more ossified. The shells of the turtles are harder. If you have managed to resist change until 2013, you've got a really hard shell, right? So what we're trying to do is create an incremental space. How would we create a space for positive deviators to exist within the public sector? Now, we know that positive deviators exist in like venture capital and stuff, but we can't replicate that for the reasons Art pointed out. We don't have necessarily a clear bottom line. So part of our cultural change is if we move from process compliance as the definition of organization success, which it will have to be for 90% of what the organization does. 90% of what any large public sector organization will do, the criteria for success has to be process compliance. You just can't create chaos, right? But in 10% of the organization, we're going to create problems that the organization agrees is hard enough and clear enough to find that we're going to set these guys loose on solving the problems and loosen them from the project compliance constraints. So again, my answer is the cultural change is going to be compromise, and it's going to be creating small spaces within large organizations on specific things, rather than, I think the rhetoric that the public sector is going to act like the private sector is now played out. That's just not going to work, right? And the idea that large public sector bureaucracies are going to turn on a dime from process compliance, large structured hierarchical, slow-changing bureaucracies into venture capital is also not in the cards. The question is, can you create kind of what they call a Skunkworks? In large organizations, they have a Skunkworks. Places that are just kind of, well, you can't have very much of our budget, but you can have a little bit of our budget and a lot of freedom, right? And then Skunkworks on problems at kind of the high level of the organization in cooperation with civil society and politicians agree, gee, it'd be really, great if we could solve this problem. So one problem for which, for instance, this approach might work is, I don't know whether you people follow India and India's politics, but there was a really high-profile rape case in India, right? Now, and then people are saying, see, we need police reform in India. We're just not going to get police reform in India of the whole turtle, because driven by this external concern for this. But you could go to the police and say, we're going to help you solve the problem of how rape victims get treated when they report a rape. Right? And that's the problem we're going to solve inside the police. We're not going to worry about corruption in regulation. We're not going to worry about process through the ranks to captain. We're just going to help you solve this problem. And let's think of the ways in which we can solve this problem. Right? And then the goal is to change the culture gradually, is that culture grows from the inside out. But you want it inside where the police agree, yeah. We really agree as a matter of survival, we need to address this problem, but we're not going to change everything about the way, the way we hire officers, the way officers are promoted, the way routine procedures of the station. We're not going to turn the whole organization to solve this problem. So that's the kind of problem, but it creates a lever. So in terms of how you would do it, you need to find these leverage points where you can get part of the turtle inside the inside the turtle saying, I really want the turtle, drag the turtle this way, and then create enough of an environment you can make it safe for them to move that direction. But it's going to be incremental, it's going to be small, and it has to drag the culture with demonstrated performance that way.
In Chennai, they have women-only police stations, which must have been an initiative of some internal champion who was less empowered.
Yeah.
And might be the Skunkworks for the nation in the way that many U.S. states have been a Skunkworks for the federal government.
No, and then practice is diffuse in that way. Which is, if somebody does it, then eventually other people look and go, well, that seems to work and didn't destroy the organization. Anyway.
Those that soldiered on this far, please help me thank you.